Hello. Oh, God. All right, my name is Matthew Jones, and colleague here is Andrew Montgomery, and we're here today to explore the question: what are the effects of a cashless society? And this question was first posed to us at a hack day run by Steer, which was an internal R&I event where we were kind of challenged to come up with innovative solutions to problems currently facing the transport industry. Now, when thinking about a cashless society or even cashless payments, we have to define what they are. And in essence, a cashless society comes down to the declining use of physical cash for financial transactions within a demographic. Now, the prevalence of cashless payments or contactless payments has shot up in recent years, as I'm sure you all know. And this is mainly due to three main things. It's convenience, efficiency, and just their ability to save you time, which are free traits which are hugely sought after in today's world, which has led to rapid uptake of the technology. However, it isn't all necessarily positive. Moving more into a digital world, there's more liability in terms of security and hacking and that kind of stuff. Moving more into like digital software platforms, should they fail, then how do people access their money? And something a bit more niche is it takes away more social interactions in our day-to-day lives, which to some people may be a good thing, but it could be seen as a concerning aspect in today's society. Now, thinking about the technology itself, obviously there's some more obvious stuff, such as, contactless debit credit cards. But moving forward, we might see more niche things such as iris scanners, facial scanners, fingerprint scanners. They may become more prevalent. Now, when implementing any kind of cashless system, there's two main drivers that need to be considered. And this is the supply side push, so essentially the willingness of an operator to provide the infrastructure and the technology, and then the demand side pull, which is simply just the consumer demand for the technology. And if you say, look in the bottom left, something like snail-paced progress, you're likely to see this in a demographic where there's likely to be limitations in terms of technological and societal advances, and it ends up in somewhere where the convenience of cashless payments isn't necessarily as good as the practicality of implementing it. Now, going more up to the rapid uptake section in the top right, that's probably what we see here in the UK. There's a mutually beneficial relationship between the consumer and the provider, where the consumer we all want it. It's great for us, it saves us time, and that gives a better business case for the operator to provide it. Now, even in a situation like this with the rapid uptake, there still needs to be considered that, for example, even in the UK, with cashless payments, there are still certain demographics that are excluded, and the inclusivity of the cashless societies does need to be improved in years to come. Now, looking at this map, you can see it highlights the 10 countries where cashless culture is most prevalent across the globe. And as you can see, it corresponds to the countries you'd expect in terms of like higher GDP and other factors such as that. And you can see Canada up there at number 1, where there's about 2 credit cards for every person. Now, if you keep an eye on like the countries highlighted here, you'll see as I move on that they correspond to the darker areas on here, which show countries that have higher amounts of bank account ownership. And this makes sense because if you don't have a bank account, you don't have access to things such as credit cards, debit cards, all that kind of stuff. And so for those who don't have bank accounts, physical cash becomes a necessity. And currently there's about 1.7 billion people in the world that don't have a bank account. Now, looking at the UK, you can see in this graph here that the green line shows the amount of physical cash used for payments, and then the blue line going up shows debit card usage. And in mid-2017, for the first time, debit card usage overtook physical card usage, so physical cash payment usage for the first time. And this is a trend that is only going to increase. I mean, to give you some numbers, in 2006, about 60% of payments were done using cash. In 2016, this dropped to 40%. In 2026, this is expected to further drop to about 20%. And it could further increase with the recent introduction of new online banks such as Monzo, all that kind of stuff. Now, looking more into London and at TfL, in October 2014, they introduced contactless payments into their underground system. And as you can see, the graph on the left shows all transactions that have occurred since then. And as you can see, there's a strong upward trend ever since. And if you look at that general profile, you can see it's somewhat mirrored in this graph on the right, which shows the amount of weekly contactless journeys since, suggesting that there is a link, but we can't necessarily say that correlation implies causation. Putting ridership aside, though, there's still benefits for both consumer and TfL as a result of this change. For us as consumers, we have to worry less about buying tickets, about the forward planning for buying them, and we also have the opportunity to save money thanks to incentives such as the daily fare cap and the hopper fare. And then for TfL themselves, there's chances to improve operational costs in terms of reducing the amount of money spent on revenue collection and handling. Logistical efficiency can be improved thanks to improved gate line efficiency if people move through. And then also, this is the opportunity for them to redistribute staff to areas of higher priority.
So Matt talked to you about the current state of cashless and the cashless trends. I'd like to talk about how we'd like to address that in the transport industry and at Steer. So we developed the Cashless Toolkit as an internal resource to allow us to talk more intelligently about cashless, as well as giving some helpful insight into the impacts of cashless payments in transport. So this is made up of two structures, the database and advisory framework. And I will talk to you about how they both work together in the next few slides. So the database is just a store of information which is to be continuously added to, made up of brief case studies, contemporary articles, and potentially expertise, internal or external, who know what they're talking about when it comes to cashless. To give you some examples of what's inside the database, here's a case study of Hong Kong's Octopus card. So Hong Kong is actually lagging behind mainland China when it comes to contactless technologies because of the success of this Octopus card. It was the second ever smart card introduced to pay for mass transit systems. And it's been so successful that it's adopted new purposes such as recording school attendance, site access to offices and housing estates, as well as becoming a credit card in its own right. Due to its ubiquitous nature there, it's actually, you could see some negatives in that people become very reliant on it, and if the systems were to fail due to malfunction or a cyber attack, people's everyday life would be greatly affected by that. Another example would just be Sweden, who are cashless frontrunner. They believe by 2020 that 0.5% of all transactions will be cash and everything else will be cashless. Even 4,000 Swedes have taken to inserting chips into their hand to pay for things, which is a bit extreme. So the other element of our cashless toolkit is the advisory framework. This is just simply what we're calling a document which will offer some initial guidance and also act as a directory to the database. So if in your cashless, and in the context of your specific cashless payment system, this would help you find some relevant evidence or case studies to be able to fully inform yourself on that scenario. So we see this being used in 3 steps. The first step just being laying out some key factors to be able to analyze the scenario in which your cashless payment is. The second step would be that using the database. So this is acting as a directory to help you navigate the database and find relevant information. And the third step would be, once you have that information, catering it to the output, whether that's a client or in your own project work. And also offering some mitigation measures and other guidance. So this is how the breakdown of our advisory framework. So you can see step 1 there with the key considerations. Step 2, asking you more in-depth questions to lead you into the database. To give you an example of that, so if you were looking at the state of technologies and people's access to cashless technology. So say, for instance, that people have a lot of access to cashless technologies and the cashless systems are actually being used a lot, like here in the UK. We could offer some discussion as to how people value money differently when they're spending it in a cashless form rather than in a physical form. Do they have different perceptions of how much they're spending, or do they mind? To go back to the framework, and then so you have that information, and then step 3 would be catering that information to output it to a client or whatever you're doing. So this would, for instance, if you're working for the public sector, financial gains may be more of a priority, whereas for the public sector, social benefits may carry more weighting. So to round that back to the question of how does the cashless society, how does it affected transport? It really depends on the context in which your cashless payment system is working. If it's done well, it could improve the service, improve accessibility to the service, and reduce operating costs. However, if you push a cashless payment system somewhere where it shouldn't, it's not ready for it, then it could end up increasing social inequality. People without bank accounts may not be able to access the service. The elderly may have trouble understanding the system. So we really hope that for quite a broad question that our toolkit will help us answer any kind of question in this kind of emerging market area. Thank you.
I have a curiosity. You talked about the benefits of this cashless method, TFL, for example, but I've noticed that there is a fraction of a second more in the kind of delivery time for the gate to open. Have you encountered any data about the negative instead effects of this from TFL side?
On TFL's side, I wouldn't say as much, no. We've just been using obviously publicly available data, and I think most of that is generally positive. And I know they've with the gate line efficiency, it's down, I think it's 500 milliseconds, I believe. Well, that's what they're aiming for. But in terms of negative implications to them, there is obviously problems with the Oyster card, for example, in terms of a lot of the dormant money on it, for example. There's about 300 million pounds worth of dormant money on Oyster cards, and they can't necessarily access it or use it. And should they ever scrap the system, what happens then? How do they dispose of that money? Do they have to give it back? So there are logistical problems associated with it, but I think they're generally outweighed by the positive stuff.
I was just wondering, at any point, did you consider also the delays in money movement in different contactless systems, just generally? Because it's something I've noticed a lot, and it might be something that disinclines people at certain income levels to use it, because if you're short on cash in your bank account, contactless isn't always the best option, because those delays might end up putting you in overdraft or in some other.
Well, not particularly, to be honest. But I guess the idea is that we're trying to build a database, and we will be maintaining it and constantly adding to it. So if there is information regarding that, we would be able to add it into it.
Kind of touching on that and relating that even back to your question, I know that TFL, when they were thinking of implementing it, that they were worried about the time when touching a contactless card for it to be approved by the bank provider. So I know they produced their own software with, I think it was Cubic, or the software provider, in order to minimize that time, which I know isn't necessarily related directly to what do you mean in terms of bank transfers, but in terms of contactless payments, there are options in order to make it more efficient.
That's just what I wanted to clarify. Really. There's contactless versus cashless, and contactless has had different amounts at the ceilings over the time frames, and probably in the different countries, so it might affect. I wasn't sure quite where that started and stopped. If you're bringing in contactless versus just using a debit card.
Well, yeah, I suppose with the Octopus card in China as well, they had a lot of issues. I think in 2010, their system did actually go down, and as I showed there, 99% of the population use them. So that is a negative implication of cashless, that it is very reliant on that. Yeah,
I think we have been a little ambiguous today in terms of talking about cashless and contactless, but it's something we definitely look to develop on. And I think for the moment, in terms of what we see in today's society, contactless payments is the main thing in terms of debit and credit card usage. So yeah.